The Illusion of Supremacy at the Rosewood, a tale of entitlement, prejudice, and the quiet power of a man who built an empire. Asterisk, asterisk. The Rosewood was not merely a restaurant. It was a sanctuary for New York City's upper echelon, a five-star establishment nestled in the beating heart of Manhattan. It was fiercely famous for catering exclusively to the city's most affluent elite, from A-list Hollywood celebrities to high-ranking politicians and Wall Street titans. The sophisticated crowd that dined within its mahogany-paneled walls valued not only the Michelin-starred, world-class cuisine, but also the undeniable social status that the restaurant symbolized. With its exceptionally soft, golden lighting, bespoke velvet seating, and impossibly elegant decor, the entire atmosphere oozed an intoxicating blend of wealth and exclusivity. The air always smelled faintly of white truffles and expensive orchids. That particular evening, the heavy brass doors swung open to reveal one of the restaurant's most notoriously demanding and historically difficult clients, Victoria Hamilton. She walked in with her usual, deeply arrogant demeanor, radiating an aura of impenetrable privilege. Wealthy since the very day she was born into a legacy real estate family, Victoria carried herself with an unmistakable air of superiority, as if the ground she walked on should be grateful for her stilettos. Her meticulously tailored, outrageously expensive haute couture dress and her understated, yet astronomically pricey diamond jewelry perfectly reflected her elite social status. She was accompanied by her longtime friend, Megan. Megan, a woman of more modest upbringing who had married into wealth, always seemed slightly uncomfortable with the overly formal, suffocating environment of these establishments, but she tried her absolute best to keep up with Victoria's punishing pace. Victoria entered the grand foyer of the Rosewood as if she held the property deed in her designer clutch. She did not bother to so much as glance at, let alone acknowledge, the impeccably dressed front-of-house staff who politely and respectfully held the heavy glass doors open for her. In her mind, she fully expected the service to be as flawless as the imported caviar, and she firmly believed that every single waiter, host, and busboy should know her name without her ever needing to introduce herself. The undercover billionaire. What Victoria utterly failed to realize was that the restaurant's actual owner, Michael Carter a brilliantly successful, self-made black entrepreneur, was working on the floor that very night as one of the waiters. Michael was a titan in the hospitality industry, a visionary businessman who generally preferred to stay behind the scenes and let his multi-million-dollar empire run itself. However, he possessed a unique, hands-on philosophy. Occasionally, he would trade his custom-tailored Tom Ford suits for a crisp white waiter's apron. He did this to directly observe how his esteemed guests and his hard-working staff interacted in real time. It was a brilliant, grounded strategy he utilized to ensure that the luxurious experience his restaurant offered was consistently living up to his impossibly high, world-renowned standards. As soon as Michael's sharp eyes saw Victoria walk through the entrance, he mentally braced himself. He knew instantly that it was going to be an exceptionally challenging night. He had heard extensive whispers about her reputation from his management team. She was a notoriously difficult customer who frequently complained about the tiniest details of the service, habitually left abysmal tips, and constantly made ridiculous, borderline impossible demands. Pushing his personal feelings aside, he approached the table with a warm, meticulously professional smile, greeting the two women with perfect posture. "Good evening, ladies. Welcome to the Rosewood. It is an absolute pleasure to have you with us tonight. May I show you to your preferred table?" Michael offered, keeping his baritone voice smooth, welcoming, and strictly cordial. Victoria barely even registered his presence. She looked right through him. "Yes, of course," she responded coldly, tossing her coat to a nearby attendant as if Michael were nothing more than a transient shadow cast upon the restaurant's polished marble floor. Megan, on the other hand, smiled politely and apologetically at Michael, but Victoria was already marching ahead, ignoring him completely. Once properly seated at one of the finest, most secluded corner tables, a spot that offered a panoramic view of the dining room, Victoria coldly glanced around, assessing the entire restaurant as if it were a newly acquired province in her personal empire. She was terribly used to doing this. "I certainly hope the service is actually up to par tonight," she remarked to her friend, deliberately raising her voice loudly enough for Michael to hear as he gracefully passed by to distribute the leather-bound menus. Michael, who was intimately used to this specific brand of high-society toxicity, kept his absolute composure. His facial expression remained an unreadable mask of hospitality. He knew the night would be agonizingly long, but he was absolutely not going to let a single customer's baseless arrogance throw him off his rhythm. He was the sole owner of the restaurant. After all, and expertly dealing with entitled people like Victoria was simply a fundamental part of the hospitality business. ###, the litany of demands. With a heavy menu in hand, Victoria immediately began firing off demands before she had even bothered to really look at the chef's carefully curated options. "I fully expect the wine to be perfectly, and I mean perfectly, chilled. Last time I was subjected to this place, it wasn't at the right temperature at all," she complained bitterly while carelessly flipping through the pristine pages. "And furthermore, I prefer my main course to be strictly made with 100% organic, locally sourced ingredients. You people have your own farm, right? Or do you just buy from the supermarket?" Michael, still smiling politely and refusing to let her condescension pierce his armor, responded calmly. "Our wine is stored at a meticulously controlled temperature in our subterranean cellar, ma'am, and I can assure you that all our ingredients come directly from our trusted, exclusive organic farming partners upstate. We will personally make sure your dining experience is absolutely perfect tonight." "It better be," Victoria muttered, waving her hand almost dismissively as she aggressively made her complex order. What the haughty Victoria simply didn't know was that Michael, the incredibly composed man she was currently treating like just another disposable servant, had vastly more control, wealth, and power over the situation than her narrow mind could ever possibly imagine. To him, this was just another fascinating sociological experiment on a Tuesday night at work. But for Victoria, this specific evening was actively setting the stage to teach her an unprecedented, life-altering lesson in humility. As Michael gracefully walked away to retrieve their initial drink order, his sharp intuition already made him acutely aware that this deeply unpleasant interaction was only the very beginning of a tense, drawn-out evening. However, he was wholly ready to handle every single obstacle with the profound calm, grace, and professionalism that always accompanied his every move in the business world. Michael returned to the table a few moments later with the exact same elegance and unshakable composure he maintained in even the most hostile boardroom negotiations. He carefully and silently placed the expensive bottle of wine on the table, presented the vintage label for her inspection, and expertly began serving it, remaining fully aware of Victoria's harsh, hypercritical gaze boring into his hands. "Let me see if it's actually at the right temperature," she sneered, not even affording Michael the basic dignity of eye contact. She picked up the delicate crystal glass and swirled the ruby liquid gently, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. She tasted the wine, holding the liquid on her palate, and keeping her sharp features locked in a neutral expression for a brief, theatrical moment before finally nodding her head an inch. "It's acceptable," she declared with a reluctant sigh. "Although I clearly would have preferred a French wine. This is Italian, right?" The question wasn't genuine. It was dripping with heavy disdain, explicitly designed to make it seem as if the mere fact that the wine was Italian was a catastrophic failure on the part of the restaurant. Michael, keeping his posture perfectly upright and his smile intact, replied, "Yes, ma'am. This is a remarkably rare Barolo vintage, sourced directly from one of Italy's most prestigious, multi-generational vineyards. However, we do have a highly extensive and excellent array of French options, if you'd prefer me to fetch the sommelier to swap the bottle." "No matter." Victoria waved her manicured hand dismissively, acting as if she were sparing his life. "Since you've already clumsily brought this one out, you can leave it. Just don't ruin the rest of the evening by hovering." Megan, sitting across from Victoria and feeling the heavy weight of the awkwardness, shot Michael a quick, desperate look as if to silently apologize for her friend's atrocious behavior. Megan always felt intensely uncomfortable in hostile situations exactly like this, but she deeply understood that Victoria actively enjoyed showing off her perceived power in high-end environments. It was a toxic sport to her. Michael, for his part, remained completely unbothered. He was immune to such petty displays. He had learned long ago that people exactly like Victoria often felt a desperate, psychological need to assert their own fragile self-worth by actively belittling those they incorrectly saw as beneath them on the social ladder. "Are you ladies ready to order your main courses?" Michael asked, maintaining his flawlessly professional tone, completely ignoring the venom in her previous statement. Victoria paused dramatically, looking over the menu with a heavy frown as if she were deciding between matters of national security rather than dinner dishes. After a few agonizing seconds designed solely to make Michael wait, she closed the menu with a loud, sharp snap. "I'll have the wild-caught salmon. But listen closely, because I want it prepared completely differently than what's written on this menu. Absolutely no heavy sauces, no rich butter, no heavy carbohydrate sides. I want something light, steamed, and entirely healthy. You understand, don't you?" She paused, her eyes finally meeting his, but only to deliver a cruel insult. "I certainly don't expect someone like you to know very much about fine dining or dietary nuance, but I trust you can at least relay this simple message correctly to the kitchen staff." Michael nodded, his expression completely unfazed by the blatant insult to his intelligence and background. "Of course, ma'am. I will personally make sure the dish is conceptualized and prepared exactly as you requested by our executive chef." "That's the absolute least you can do," Victoria muttered under her breath, instantly turning her attention back to Megan and completely freezing Michael out of her peripheral vision. Trying desperately to ease the suffocating tension at the table, Megan made her order in a much friendlier, warmer manner, politely asking for a simple, seasonal house salad and thanking Michael profusely. He offered her a genuine, warm nod and walked away to relay the demanding orders to the back of the house. The kitchen's sanctuary. As he walked smoothly across the dining room floor, Michael silently reflected on the troubling interaction. That specific kind of brazen, arrogant behavior wasn't entirely new to him, especially not in a hyper-elite luxury restaurant where many mega-wealthy customers felt inherently entitled to treat service staff with outright disdain. He knew, with absolute certainty, that his physical appearance, being a tall, distinguished black man, acting in a discreet, subservient waiter's role, frequently triggered both unconscious and highly explicit racial and class biases, exactly like the ones Victoria was so shamelessly displaying. But unlike many of the other incredibly hardworking employees in the service industry who might understandably feel emotionally crushed, angry, or entirely powerless in the face of such degrading behavior, Michael was operating from a vastly unique position. He was the multi-millionaire owner of the Rosewood, which stood as one of the city's most globally renowned restaurants, and he had painstakingly earned that immense wealth and status through decades of grueling hard work, endless perseverance, and undeniable brilliance. He wielded a level of systemic and financial power that Victoria couldn't even begin to fathom, and possessing that secret knowledge gave him a profound, untouchable sense of zen-like calm, despite the horrid disrespect he was currently receiving. Back in the pristine, stainless steel sanctuary of the kitchen, the sounds of sizzling pans and shouting line cooks filled the air. Michael calmly explained Victoria's complex, off-menu demands to the executive chef, who immediately paused his plating and raised a highly skeptical eyebrow. "Is she always like this?" "Good grief," the chef asked, shaking his head with a wry smile. Michael simply shrugged, wiping down a service tray. "Tonight, it genuinely seems she's on a very special, personal mission to test the absolute limits of our patience. But the food needs to come out exactly as she wants it, down to the millimeter. We cannot, and will not, give her even a fraction of an inch of room for valid complaints." The chef chuckled darkly and nodded in deep respect to his boss. "Leave it completely to me, Mr. Carter. It'll be flawless." The unrelenting scrutiny. As the demanding custom order was being meticulously prepared by the culinary team, Michael continued to float around the dining room, seamlessly serving other high-profile tables while constantly keeping a watchful, discreet eye on Victoria's erratic behavior. Several times throughout the hour, he noticed her actively watching him from afar, her eyes narrowed, as if she were ruthlessly evaluating his every single micromovement. It was incredibly obvious that she was practically salivating, eagerly waiting to find something, anything wrong with his service. She desperately needed something she could loudly criticize in order to validate and reinforce her deeply fragile sense of racial and class superiority. After some time, Victoria's highly customized salmon dish was ready for the floor. Michael made a deliberate point of bringing it out to the table himself, carrying the hot porcelain carefully and placing it gently directly in front of her. "Your wild-caught salmon, expertly prepared exactly as requested, ma'am," he said with a slight, impeccably professional smile. Victoria looked down at the steaming plate as if she were a harsh art critic inspecting a potentially forged painting. She slowly, agonizingly picked up her heavy silver fork, cut a tiny, delicate piece of the pink fish, and brought it up to her mouth. There was an incredibly tense pause, and Michael stood completely still, watching as she chewed slowly with a rigid, entirely neutral expression. Finally, she dropped the fork back onto the plate with a small clink. "It's acceptable," she stated coldly. "But frankly, I've had much better at far less pretentious establishments." Megan let out a small, highly stressed sigh, casting a deeply sympathetic, apologetic glance up at Michael, who miraculously remained completely unflappable. "I'm very glad to hear it is to your liking, ma'am," Michael replied with utterly impeccable composure, his voice never wavering. "If you or your guests need absolutely anything else to elevate your evening, I will be standing nearby." "I certainly expect so," Victoria responded with ice in her tone, before aggressively turning her shoulder back to her friend and continuing their private conversation as if Michael had instantly turned totally invisible. The escalation of prejudice. Unfortunately for everyone in the immediate vicinity, Victoria was only just beginning her cruel night of superiority. After officially giving her mediocre verdict on the masterfully cooked salmon, she continued her hushed conversation with Megan, but always with the tense, predatory air of someone eagerly waiting for another golden opportunity to criticize the hired help. "Have you honestly noticed how the overall service here is a bit, well, severely below standard lately?" Victoria remarked casually, making absolutely no effort to lower her piercing voice. "It's certainly not what it used to be. Back when real waiters worked here, they actually knew what they were doing and how to treat people of our stature." Megan gave a very quick, highly uncomfortable, panicked glance to the adjacent table, where two other well-dressed diners seemed to have clearly overheard the incredibly rude comment and were now frowning. "I really think he's doing a very good job, Victoria," Megan replied carefully, trying to defuse the ticking time bomb. "He really seems to be trying his best." Victoria let out a loud, highly dismissive, mocking laugh that cut through the soft jazz music. "Simply trying isn't nearly enough in a place like this, Megan. If you're paying this astronomical amount of money for a single meal, you have the absolute, undeniable right to expect total perfection. And honestly, looking at him, I don't think they even train their staff properly anymore. They probably just hire anyone off the street these days to meet quotas." She leaned in conspiratorially, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "I mean, just look at him over there. He seems so incredibly out of place here. It's like he doesn't know what real, generational luxury even is." Megan frowned deeply, her patience wearing exceptionally thin. "You're exaggerating terribly, Victoria. He's been nothing but polite and accommodating the entire time we've been here." "Politeness isn't enough," Victoria retorted quickly and sharply. "He should instinctively know how to read his high-end customers. Adapt to us. Cater to our unspoken needs. For example, I fully expected him to know exactly which elite wine would pair best with the custom dish I ordered. But of course, you simply cannot expect that level of refined intellect from someone exactly like him, can you? Michael, who was standing close enough by the service station to hear the ugly exchange, continued to discreetly polish wine glasses and serve other tables, but his sharp ears clearly caught every single venomous word she spat. He was highly used to being the unfortunate target of such thinly veiled, racially charged comments. But unlike many cowardly customers who kept their vile opinions to themselves, Victoria seemed violently determined to make her prejudice as clear and public as possible. As the dark evening slowly wore on, Victoria relentlessly continued to hunt for minuscule, imaginary flaws in every single detail of the service. She loudly complained that the fresh linen napkin Michael brought was folded slightly imperfectly. She claimed the spotless silver fork didn't seem as polished as it truly should be. She whined that the sparkling water wasn't cold enough for her delicate throat. Each forced interaction was utilized as just another opportunity for her to ruthlessly flaunt her perceived superiority. Do you honestly think he knows absolutely anything about real, authentic wine? Victoria asked Megan with a cruel, mocking smile plastered across her face. I highly doubt a guy like that could even tell the difference between a premier Grand Cru Bordeaux and a cheap bottle of grocery store swill. Hearing the summons of her snapping fingers, Michael returned to the table once more, standing tall. Can I get you ladies anything else to drink, ma'am? Victoria looked up at him with unadulterated disdain, her eyes scanning him up and down as if she were silently evaluating whether he was even biologically worthy of speaking to her. You seem to know very, very little about fine wine. How on earth can I possibly trust you to recommend anything decent for my second glass? Michael steadfastly maintained his calm, deeply respectful tone, refusing to give her the angry reaction she so desperately craved. We'd be more than happy to bring you another exquisite option, ma'am. We have an absolutely excellent, world-renowned selection of French wines in our cellar. If you prefer, I can personally recommend a stunning 2005 vintage Bordeaux. Its complex, earthy notes and structured tannins pair remarkably beautifully with the specific herb profile of the fish dish you just enjoyed. Victoria physically recoiled, raising a perfectly plucked eyebrow, genuinely shocked by the highly sophisticated, incredibly unexpected culinary response. But she was far too proud and stubborn to ever admit she was impressed. Well, maybe you've just gotten incredibly lucky and managed to memorize something off a flashcard, she said, her voice dripping with thick sarcasm. Go ahead, bring the Bordeaux, and don't spill it. As Michael gave a polite nod and walked away toward the cellar to fetch the expensive bottle, Megan finally snapped, shooting Victoria a harsh, deeply disapproving look. Why on earth are you being so relentlessly hard on him? He clearly knows exactly what he's doing, Victoria. Oh, please, spare me the lecture, Megan, Victoria responded with a sickeningly self-satisfied, arrogant smile. It's all simply part of the luxury experience. I am testing the service, seeing if they truly measure up to my standards. That's exactly what people like us do in places exactly like this. The boiling point. When Michael finally returned to the dining room floor with the dust-covered bottle of vintage Bordeaux, he meticulously made sure to follow all the strict sommelier protocols perfectly. He confidently presented the aged label to Victoria for her inspection, carefully uncorked it, poured a tiny, precise amount into her glass for her to taste, and stood back, waiting patiently for her final approval. She tasted the incredibly expensive wine, holding the glass up to the light theatrically, swirling it as if she were the head judge in an international sommelier competition. It's acceptable, she finally declared, repeating her favorite backhanded compliment. Basic service, but passable. Michael poured the rest of the wine with flawless, quiet professionalism and stepped away again, knowing deep down that Victoria would inevitably continue finding something else to complain about. But he kept his impeccable posture rigid and his mind completely clear. You see, Victoria whispered harshly, turning back to Megan the second he was out of earshot. It took an immense amount of pushing and prodding for him to finally get it right. This is exactly the kind of harsh discipline you have to use to teach these people how to behave. It's simply not enough to just stand around being polite if you fundamentally don't know how to serve your betters. The underlying tension in the restaurant's atmosphere was rapidly starting to build to a dangerous boiling point. Other wealthy diners were now openly noticing Victoria's loudly toxic comments, and a few highly disapproving, judgmental glances were being cast directly toward her corner table. Megan, now visibly sweating and entirely uncomfortable with the scene they were causing, desperately tried to change the subject. "Maybe we should just try to enjoy the rest of the dinner in peace," she suggested, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to lighten the suffocating mood. But Victoria wasn't even close to being ready to stop her crusade. "The essential thing is, Megan, people fundamentally need to know their exact place in the world, no matter where you are. If you're supposedly working in a high-end luxury restaurant, you should thoroughly understand what your status means. This waiter, or whatever the hell he actually is, clearly has absolutely no idea where he is or who he is dealing with." Michael, while quietly organizing a stack of incoming orders over by the kitchen doors, astutely noticed that the ugly situation was now drawing significantly more attention than usual. He could practically feel the heavy, uncomfortable looks from the other service staff and the regular customers, many of whom personally knew exactly who Michael Carter really was, and were utterly baffled as to why he was allowing a customer to speak to him this way. But Michael was resolute. He was incredibly determined to strictly keep his undercover identity a complete secret until the absolutely perfect, most devastating moment presented itself. Victoria's blind arrogance grew by the passing minute, and Michael knew with absolute certainty that the final, glorious reveal would be totally inevitable and, in a profound way, incredibly satisfying. He also knew he had to be patient and wait for the perfect, indisputable moment to act. The horrific prejudice and overt condescension she was actively showing, though deeply disturbing and offensive, were tragically nothing new to him. As a black man climbing to the very top of the cutthroat corporate world, he had faced countless people exactly like her throughout his long, arduous career. But he had always known that maintaining his quiet dignity, his sharp intellect, and his unshakable grace was his absolute greatest weapon against their ignorance. And as he looked across the dining room at the sneering woman, Michael Carter knew one thing for certain. The night was far, far from over. The illusion of control and the off-menu trap. Victoria, feeling completely intoxicated by her own perceived supremacy and believing she had absolute control over the situation, decided it was time to push Michael even further. She slowly looked around the restaurant, her critical eyes sweeping over the elegant mahogany furniture, the sparkling crystal chandeliers, and the sophisticated clientele that filled the room. A wicked idea began to form in her mind. "I want something special," she announced, abruptly cutting off her superficial conversation with Megan. She raised her hand with a sharp, demanding snap of her fingers to get Michael's attention, treating him as if he had been entirely invisible until that very second. When he approached the table with his usual quiet grace, Victoria crossed her arms defensively and shot him a deeply challenging, condescending look. "I want something that is explicitly not on the menu. Something vastly more personalized," she demanded. Her tone made it abundantly clear that this was not a genuine culinary desire, but rather a calculated test designed to make him stumble. Michael, effortlessly keeping his calm and rigidly professional demeanor, replied without a hint of hesitation. "Of course, ma'am. How exactly can I assist you with this custom request?" Victoria smirked, her eyes gleaming with malice, as if she were already anticipating his spectacular failure. "I'd like a seafood dish, but with a highly unique twist. Something genuinely creative, and please, absolutely nothing too ordinary." "Surprise me," she challenged. Megan looked at her friend, visibly squirming in her seat, utterly mortified by the escalating hostility. "Victoria, I really think you're going too far," Megan whispered urgently. "Going too far?" Victoria laughed, a cold, sharp sound that cut through the ambient jazz. "I'm simply demanding the elite level of service that a place like this claims to offer. If they cannot handle a few special requests, They simply do not deserve the prestige they constantly boast about. Michael nodded slightly, his expression an impenetrable fortress of hospitality. I will do my absolute best to meet your exacting request, ma'am. I will personally consult the executive chef and return shortly with a suitable suggestion. Victoria smiled broadly, deeply satisfied with the malicious idea of pushing Michael and the restaurant to their absolute breaking points. She truly believed she was putting him in an impossible, degrading position, and watching someone she deemed beneath her struggle gave her a profound, sickening sense of pleasure. The culinary masterpiece and a refusal to yield. As Michael walked smoothly back to the bustling kitchen, he already knew exactly what was coming. This specific kind of toxic behavior, forcing an unusually complex request solely to test the patience and skill of a waiter or chef, was shockingly common among ultra-wealthy customers who desperately needed to assert their social superiority. He had seen it manifest 1,000 times over his many years in the hospitality industry. However, he wasn't worried in the slightest. In fact, he knew his world-class culinary team was more than capable of handling such petty challenges. Stepping into the heat of the kitchen, Michael calmly explained the special request to the executive chef. She wants seafood, but with a unique twist. Something off-menu, he said, knowing the seasoned chef would immediately understand the psychological game in play. She's trying to test you. The chef replied with a knowing, amused grin, wiping his hands on a pristine towel. Don't you worry about a thing, boss. I'll whip up something incredibly special. Something that'll make her think twice before ever try to test us again. Michael smiled back, his confidence unshakable. She's pushing boundaries, but we're used to navigating these waters. We just need to keep doing exactly what we do best. While the chef began meticulously preparing the complex dish, Michael returned to the floor, seamlessly serving other high-profile tables, but he always kept a watchful, peripheral eye on Victoria's table. He could practically feel her eagerness to find any microscopic fault in the service. Occasionally, she would shoot sharp glances in his direction, scrutinizing his every move like a hawk, desperately waiting for an opportunity to launch a complaint. After some time, the bespoke seafood dish was finally ready for presentation. Michael made absolute sure to deliver it personally, fully aware that this was a crucial juncture in the evening. When he arrived at her table, he placed the stunningly plated dish in front of Victoria with all the delicate care and meticulous professionalism she repeatedly doubted he possessed. Your custom dish, ma'am. The chef has prepared an exquisite combination of line-caught, grilled Mediterranean seafood, gently dusted with a proprietary blend of exotic spices, accompanied by a vibrant, organic herb puree and perfectly blanched fresh spring vegetables. I truly hope it is to your liking, he said. Victoria looked down at the plate with a predatory, satisfied smile, as if she were eagerly waiting for the exact moment she could tear the effort to shreds. She picked up her heavy silver fork with agonizing slowness, cutting a delicate piece of the grilled fish and bringing it to her lips. There was a prolonged, heavy pause as she chewed slowly, her eyes darting around as if she were actively trying to locate a flaw in the flavor profile. But much to her immense, hidden surprise, the food was absolutely flawless. The texture, the temperature, and the seasoning were all masterclass. However, her monumental pride would never allow her to admit defeat. It's acceptable, she finally declared, stubbornly maintaining the exact same disdainful, unimpressed tone as before. But honestly, I expected something far more creative for a place like this. It's really not much different from what you'd find at any ordinary bistro. Megan, who was already drowning in secondhand embarrassment, couldn't help but sigh out loud. Victoria, I really think you're being far too harsh. The dish looks absolutely excellent, and it smells divine. Victoria's eyes flashed with irritation. No, I'm not being harsh, she insisted, fixing her posture. I'm just demanding the uncompromising standard this restaurant should inherently offer. When you pay top dollar for a meal, absolute perfection is what you expect. They need to understand that sophisticated customers like me will never settle for the ordinary. Michael, staying completely composed and refusing to take the bait, replied calmly. I completely understand your perspective, ma'am. If you happen to need anything else to elevate your dining experience, I will be nearby. I certainly hope so, Victoria replied icily, not breaking eye contact. She was clearly waiting for him to fail in some tangible way. But so far, Michael had not given her a single, concrete reason to validate her cruelty. As Michael walked away, he could feel the heavy, oppressive weight of Victoria's hostile gaze burning into his back. She was fiercely determined to test his patience to the absolute limit. But Michael wasn't the type of man to be easily shaken. He had faced infinitely harder challenges in his life and career, and he knew that expertly dealing with entitled customers like Victoria was merely the cost of his massive success. He returned to the kitchen, where the chef gave him a curious, expectant look. Did she like it? Michael smiled a very slight, knowing smile. She said it was acceptable, which, coming from a woman like her, is probably the highest compliment you can receive. The chef laughed heartily. Sounds like she's much tougher than our usual crowd, but don't sweat it. We'll keep showing her who really knows fine food around here. The ugly face of prejudice. As the dark evening dragged on, Victoria seemed to become even more aggressively determined to assert her delusional superiority. Her arrogance, which was highly noticeable right from the start, began to take a much darker, far more personal, and deeply offensive turn. Every single interaction with Michael, the waiter she so firmly saw as entirely beneath her, became a weaponized opportunity to reinforce her deeply ingrained, prejudiced views. It's genuinely amazing who they allow to hire these days, Victoria muttered to Megan under her breath, watching Michael flawlessly serve a nearby table of executives. She smiled coldly, as if sharing a toxic inside joke. You know, Megan, this restaurant used to exclusively hire real, polished professionals. Now, it seems literally anyone off the street can put on a white apron and pretend to understand fine dining. Megan, once again paralyzed by her extreme discomfort, tried desperately to steer the dangerous conversation away. Victoria, please, I think he's doing a wonderful job. Everything has been completely fine so far. Victoria scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes. That's only because your personal standards are far too low, Megan. Just look at him. He seems much more suited for street work or manual labor. I truly don't understand how someone like that ends up serving the elite at the Rosewood. Michael, thanks to the acoustics of the room, overheard the vile comment from a distance. He was sadly used to this specific kind of subtle, systemic disdain, but this time, Victoria's tone was becoming increasingly explicit and undeniably racial. He remained outwardly calm, fully knowing the big, devastating reveal was coming soon, but he simply couldn't ignore the heavy, historical weight of her cruel words. The blatant racism Victoria so easily and comfortably displayed was something Michael had battled his entire life, from his humble, struggling youth all the way up to the glittering peak of his immense success as a billionaire business owner. When he calmly returned to the table to clear their plates, Victoria was locked and loaded, ready to strike again. "Waiter," she snapped, not even bothering to look at him, "it seems you completely forgot to bring the side dish I asked for. I know it must be terribly hard for you to follow simple, basic instructions, but it would be really great if you could actually bring what I ordered." Michael, utilizing his legendary patience, calmly replied, "I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am. I will bring it out right away." Victoria finally looked up at him, and for the very first time that night, she made direct, prolonged eye contact, but her gaze was entirely filled with unadulterated contempt. "You'd better, assuming you can even understand what I'm saying." She let out a slight, mocking laugh and looked directly at Megan, who was actively trying to hide her burning face behind her wine glass. "You know, Megan, sometimes I simply forget that certain employees just don't have the same educated background as we do. They just fundamentally don't understand what quality service means, no matter how hard they try to mimic it." Michael stood completely firm, despite the obvious, cutting attack on his character. He knew Victoria wasn't just criticizing his work ethic anymore. She was directly attacking his identity, his race, and his humanity. The horrifying way she treated him, not as a human being worthy of respect, but as a disposable object of her own arrogance, was something he decided he couldn't and wouldn't ignore for much longer. After swiftly serving the missing side dish, Michael was just about to walk away when Victoria stopped him yet again. "Wait a moment," she ordered, fixing him with a falsely curious look that masked a deeply hidden malice. "I have a question for you. Have you ever even had the chance to visit a luxurious place like this before you started working here?" Michael, fully and acutely understanding the vile racist insinuation lurking behind the question, stayed incredibly calm. "Yes, ma'am, I visit places exactly like this quite regularly." Victoria let out a soft, patronizing chuckle. "Oh, of course you do." She shook her head slightly, acting as if she were deeply amused by her own cruel joke. "But honestly, I'm genuinely curious. How exactly did someone like you get a job here? I mean, let's be honest, you don't exactly look like the type of person I'd ever expect to see working at a high society establishment like the Rosewood." The public humiliation and blatant, unfiltered racism in those specific words were instantly noticed by several nearby tables. The lively chatter in the dining room abruptly ceased, growing dead silent as wealthy patrons turned to watch the incredibly uncomfortable, highly offensive scene unfold. Megan lowered her head entirely, clearly humiliated by her friend's atrocious behavior, but she tragically lacked the moral courage to intervene. Michael took a deep, centering breath. He knew the perfect moment to reveal the ultimate truth was rapidly approaching, but Victoria seemed even more determined to dig her own grave. "Have you ever thought," she continued, now adopting a sickeningly patronizing, pseudo-helpful tone, "that maybe you should just stick to places where you fit in a bit better? It's not a criticism, just an observation. Places like this can be very complicated for certain people to navigate. The ultimate unmasking." At this exact, volatile moment, the general manager, Daniel, swiftly approached the table. He had been quietly informed by the floor staff about the rapidly growing tension and knew something decisive had to be done before the ugly situation spiraled completely out of control. "Good evening, ma'am," Daniel said with a tight, forced smile, projecting authority. "It seems there has been a problem. How can I assist you tonight?" Victoria turned her venomous attention to him, puffing up with an exaggerated air of authority. "Yes, there's a massive problem. This waiter," she gestured aggressively toward Michael without even bothering to look at him, "clearly isn't up to the luxury standards of this restaurant. I truly don't understand how you allow people with absolutely no professional training or class to work in a place like this. Honestly, I'm shocked that the Rosewood has fallen so disastrously far in quality under your management." Daniel kept his professional eyes firmly fixed on Victoria, but his expression didn't change a single millimeter. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was the exact moment Michael had been patiently waiting for. With a barely noticeable, highly respectful nod, Daniel stepped back and invited Michael to take the lead. "Ma'am," Michael began, stepping forward, his posture shifting from the deferential stance of a waiter to the commanding, powerful presence of a CEO. "I understand your experience hasn't been to your liking tonight. But before we continue this conversation, there is something very important you need to know." Victoria narrowed her heavily made-up eyes, utterly unsure of what he was about to say, but still clinging to her arrogance. "And what might that be?" she spat. Michael stayed remarkably calm, but this time his deep voice carried the immense, undeniable weight of someone who held all the cards. "I'm the owner of the Rosewood." The psychological impact of his 6 words was immediate, absolute, and utterly devastating. The smug, superior smile that had been permanently plastered on Victoria's face vanished in a microsecond. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her ash pale, instantly replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated shock. Megan, sitting across from her, loudly gasped and covered her mouth with her trembling hand, completely unable to process what she had just heard. What?" Victoria stammered pathetically, her voice trembling and completely stripped of its former power. You're joking, right? This is a joke." Michael remained a pillar of composure. "No, ma'am. I'm entirely serious. My name is Michael Carter. I own this restaurant, as well as the hospitality group that manages it. I occasionally work undercover as a waiter to personally ensure that my valued customers are getting the absolute best experience possible, and more importantly, to observe exactly how both the staff and the guests interact in real life. I've been doing this successfully for years. Victoria was paralyzed, entirely frozen in her seat. All of her false confidence, her arrogant, towering posture, and her thinly veiled racism completely crumbled into dust in front of everyone nearby. The luxury restaurant, which was once filled with lively, sophisticated conversations, was now dead silent, with dozens of judging eyes firmly fixed on Victoria's table. I didn't know. Victoria tried to stammer out an apology, now visibly panicked and sweating under the crushing weight of public scrutiny. If I had known you were, if I knew you were the owner, I would never have. That is exactly the problem, ma'am, Michael interrupted, his voice slicing through her pathetic excuse like a newly sharpened blade. It shouldn't matter in the slightest who I am, whether I'm a billionaire owner or just a hardworking waiter trying to make a living. What truly matters is how you choose to treat people. And tonight, you treated me with complete, unfiltered disrespect, not just as an employee, but as a human being. Victoria opened and closed her mouth several times like a landed fish, completely unable to form a single coherent response. Megan, sitting frozen beside her, couldn't hide her profound shame and intense discomfort, silently wishing the elegant floor would open up and swallow her whole. Michael continued, his voice ringing with absolute moral authority. Here at the Rosewood, we value basic human respect above all else. No matter someone's race, financial status, or professional position, absolutely everyone is treated with dignity under my roof. And tonight, ma'am, you spectacularly failed to show that. Victoria, utterly humiliated and stripped of her protective armor of wealth, finally lowered her tear-filled eyes, completely unable to look at Michael. I'm sorry, she muttered weakly, but her hollow words were entirely empty, lacking any of the genuine weight needed to fix the catastrophic situation she had created. Michael gave a small, dismissive nod, effortlessly maintaining his dignity and power. I sincerely hope your next visit to whatever establishment will have you is vastly different, ma'am, and that you'll take a long time to reflect on exactly what happened here tonight. You are no longer welcome at the Rosewood. With that final, devastating decree, he turned and stepped away from the table, leaving Victoria completely alone to suffocate under the crushing weight of her own toxic actions. Around them, the silence was thick and palpable as the other elite guests quietly absorbed the masterclass in justice they had just witnessed. For the very first time in a very long while, Victoria was completely out of control, and this time, there were no financial excuses or family connections that could possibly save her ruined image. The walk of shame and quiet reflections. Victoria sat in absolute, deafening silence, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently on the crisp, white linen tablecloth. The overwhelming grandeur of the Rosewood, which had once seemed so wonderfully opulent and welcoming to her, now felt like a terrifying, suffocating prison. The quiet, judgmental murmurs rapidly spreading from table to table, and the lingering, disgusted stares from the other high society guests weighed incredibly heavily on her shoulders. For the very first time that night, and perhaps in her entire privileged life, she felt infinitesimally small and completely powerless. Megan, still entirely speechless and refusing to make eye contact, glanced at her disgraced friend with a complex mixture of pity and deep embarrassment. "Victoria, I really think we should go right now," she whispered urgently, her voice thick with panic and discomfort. Victoria, completely unable to cognitively process the sheer magnitude of everything that had just happened, simply nodded her head like a broken doll. She could barely manage to stand on her own 2 feet, feeling the crushing, agonizing weight of each individual step as she slowly walked toward the grand exit. For the first time in her insulated life, her towering arrogance and weaponized confidence had been totally shattered in a highly public an undeniably permanent way. As she forced herself to walk past the occupied tables, she could physically feel the piercing eyes burning into her. Eyes filled with intense judgment, harsh disapproval, and perhaps even outright disgust. The exact same racist disdain and superiority she had so freely projected onto Michael throughout the entire night was now being aimed directly back at her by her own peers, and the psychological impact was utterly devastating. Victoria had always foolishly believed herself to be inherently above everyone else, completely untouchable inside her glittering bubble of wealth and privilege. But now her entire worldview had been violently turned upside down. On her agonizing way out the front doors, she passed Daniel, the steadfast manager, who stood tall and watched her leave with a serene, almost completely indifferent expression on his face. He said absolutely nothing, but his cold eyes conveyed a crystal-clear message. There was a strict, unyielding new standard of human behavior at the Rosewood, and toxic customers exactly like Victoria were simply no longer welcome if they couldn't meet it. Victoria and Megan finally spilled out of the restaurant in complete silence, the biting, cold New York City night cutting through the air with an intensity that perfectly mirrored Victoria's frozen emotional state. Outside, the luxury cars drove by, and the vibrant city life continued on, entirely indifferent to her profound humiliation. Back inside the warm, golden glow of the restaurant, Michael allowed himself a quiet, private moment of reflection near the bar. He knew deep down that tonight had been incredibly significant, not just for publicly exposing Victoria's vile prejudice, but for firmly reaffirming his core values as both a powerful businessman and a decent human being. He had fought relentlessly for absolutely everything he had, climbing his way up from his humble, challenging beginnings to owning one of the city's most globally prestigious culinary empires. And all along that difficult way, he had unfortunately faced many people exactly like Victoria. Ignorant individuals who judged him instantly based solely on his skin color or outward appearance without ever taking a second to know his true, remarkable story. Daniel walked over, holding a freshly printed receipt, and approached Michael, gently interrupting his profound thoughts. "Is everything all right, sir?" Daniel asked quietly, looking at his boss with deep respect. Michael looked out over the beautifully lit dining room, watching his diverse, talented staff working in perfect harmony, and finally let a genuine, warm smile reach his eyes. "Everything is perfectly fine, Daniel," Michael replied softly. "In fact, I think tonight was a complete success. Let's get back to work." The aftermath of entitlement. "You handled that exceedingly well, Michael." She truly had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with, Daniel murmured, stepping closer as he watched the grand oak doors slowly close behind the disgraced socialite. He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for an hour. Michael turned toward his trusted manager and gave a very slight, profoundly tired smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It certainly wasn't the first time I've faced that exact brand of ugliness, Daniel," Michael replied softly, his baritone voice a soothing anchor in the remaining tension. "And unfortunately, given the world we live in, I know it won't be the last." Daniel shook his head, his expression filled with deep respect. "Perhaps, but this was a remarkably important victory tonight. She will never, ever forget this humiliation." Michael's expression shifted, his tone becoming noticeably more serious and reflective. "I truly hope she learned something valuable from it," he replied. "I'm not in this business to publicly humiliate anyone, Daniel, even those who desperately deserve it. I am simply here to firmly remind people that absolutely everyone deserves basic human respect. Whether I am the billionaire owner signing the paychecks or just a hardworking waiter trying to clear a table, what fundamentally matters is the undeniable dignity with which we choose to treat one another." Slowly, the tense atmosphere of the luxurious restaurant was beginning to return to its normal, vibrant rhythm. The affluent guests were cautiously resuming their sophisticated conversations, the soft clinking of crystal wine glasses and heavy silver cutlery blending seamlessly with the low, smooth melodies of the live jazz trio in the corner. However, many patrons were still leaning in close over their candlelit tables, urgently whispering about the spectacular, unprecedented confrontation they had just witnessed. Michael discreetly glanced around the expansive, golden-lit dining room, deeply satisfied to see that even after the explosive episode with Victoria, the refined, welcoming energy of the room remained entirely intact. He had managed to keep his unshakable composure under immense fire, and that quiet strength had been more than enough to prevent the volatile situation from spiraling out of control and ruining the evening for his other guests. A shift in the atmosphere. Shortly after the dining room settled, a steady trickle of well-heeled customers began intentionally approaching Michael as they finished their expensive meals. They weren't just leaving generous tips. They were going out of their way to personally thank him for the consistently excellent service and the profoundly welcoming, safe atmosphere he had so carefully cultivated. An elegant elderly woman, adorned in vintage Chanel and a string of flawless South Sea pearls, slowly rose from one of the premium nearby tables and walked up to him with the assistance of a silver-tipped cane. "You are a remarkably patient and deeply honorable man," she said, her voice fragile, but carrying a distinctly kind, genuine smile that reached her bright blue eyes. Not everyone would have possessed the immense inner strength to keep their composure in front of a cruel, entitled woman exactly like that. Michael smiled back warmly, visibly touched by her unexpected kindness and maternal warmth. "Thank you very, very much, ma'am. Sometimes, maintaining our patience and holding on to our peace is the absolute best and most powerful response we can give to ignorance." She nodded slowly in profound agreement, her diamond earrings catching the ambient light as she carefully picked up her designer purse and began getting ready to leave for the evening. "You have built a truly beautiful, magnificent restaurant here, young man. It has a soul. I will certainly be back much more often, and I will be bringing my entire family." Michael bowed his head slightly, thanking her again, and watched with a heart full of quiet pride as she was escorted out by the hostess. He suddenly felt vastly more confident in his lifelong mission to make the Rosewood not just a hub of culinary excellence, but a genuine sanctuary of mutual respect. He was fiercely determined to cultivate an atmosphere of true equality, proving that luxury and human decency were never mutually exclusive. Quiet reflections in the shadows. Hours later, as the long, eventful night finally came to a graceful close and the sprawling restaurant emptied out of its last lingering patrons, Michael slowly walked through the quiet, dimming corridors back to his private executive office located in the rear of the sprawling establishment. He unbuttoned his vest, loosened his tie with a heavy sigh, and sank deeply into his plush leather executive chair, allowing himself a few rare, uninterrupted minutes of silent reflection in the dim, amber glow of his desk lamp. Although he had successfully navigated and dealt with fiercely similar, racially charged situations many times before in his life, there was something distinctly different and deeply visceral about this particular confrontation with Victoria Hamilton. Perhaps it was the sheer, unfiltered rawness of the prejudice she had so casually displayed, or perhaps it was the profound satisfaction of the way he had, once again, definitively proven that grace, respect, and unwavering dignity will always ultimately prevail over hatred. Sitting alone in the quiet sanctuary of his office, he thought deeply about his arduous, uphill journey. He reflected on the countless, monumental obstacles he had faced as an ambitious black man trying to carve out a space in a cutthroat hospitality industry completely dominated by generational white elites. He remembered the humiliating bank loans he was unfairly denied, the constant, exhausting challenges of simply being seen as an equal by his wealthy peers, and exactly how unbelievably hard he had worked to irrefutably prove that he not only belonged at the very top of this exclusive world, but that he could completely thrive and dominate within it. The ugly incident with Victoria served as a stark, sobering reminder that the difficult fight against systemic prejudice was an ongoing, daily battle. But simultaneously, it was a beautiful, empowering reaffirmation that he was walking exactly on the right path. The power of resilience. The sound of soft, Hesitant footsteps at the heavy oak door gently interrupted his deep thoughts. It was Daniel, holding a stack of nightly reports, who had entered the office with a slight, knowing smile on his tired face. "I really think you deserved a much quieter, far more boring night after everything you've built. Don't you think, boss?" Daniel joked lightly, trying to ease the lingering weight of the evening. Michael let out a rich, genuine laugh, shaking his head slowly as he looked at his friend. "Definitely. I wouldn't have minded a boring Tuesday. But honestly, Daniel, I think tonight was absolutely one of those rare, clarifying moments that sharply remind us exactly why we do what we do every single day." Daniel nodded emphatically, his expression turning entirely sincere. "You did vastly more than just keep your cool out there on the floor today, Michael. You actively showed every single person in that dining room exactly what true, unshakable dignity looks like in the face of sheer ugliness." Michael smiled back, a sense of profound peace washing over him as he rose from his comfortable chair and grabbed his tailored suit jacket. "I think we can all learn something valuable from emotionally taxing nights exactly like this one. And hopefully, wherever she's right now, Victoria finally did too." As Michael reached out and turned off the warm office lights, plunging the room into comfortable darkness, he prepared to finally leave his empire for the night. He walked out of the building and stepped into the cool, refreshing New York City air with the absolute, ironclad certainty that, although vicious prejudice and blind arrogance still heavily existed in the world, he possessed the immense, quiet power to relentlessly fight it with calm intelligence, fierce resilience, and uncompromised integrity. And that powerful truth, for him, was more than enough to sleep soundly.